Hello. After listening to the presentation of Mr. Karkalesis and the previous panel, I'll try to frame the discussion under a different angle. So I will land on the insightful remarks of the Draghi report. So Professor Draghi was explicit about the innovation gap that Europe is facing. He explicitly stated that the European SMEs lack in AI adoption. Almost 13% of the European SMEs actually adopt AI technologies. Innovation gap is actually widening. And so we are lacking a very solid and robust business model and development for AI. So at the same time, we see other superpowers in the AI race following a very specific course. For example, China explicitly banned the NVIDIA chips and is focusing and steering its domestic market towards a domestic stack. At the same time, we see at the other part of the Atlantic, we saw a mega deal very recently between NVIDIA and OpenAI, aiming at generating supercomputing, superpower. So at this point, Europe has a stark choice to make. We need to identify the specifications of a solid AI infrastructure and governance model. So, Mr. Freitas, can you please tell us your views on how you envisage such a solid and robust European AI infrastructure?
I think it's interesting that you mentioned, for example, the Chinese model. Out of curiosity, I was there on vacation, actually last month, with a lot of Chinese friends. And I think there's an aspect that often is overlooked in Europe, that is how all of that gets funding. And I think in Europe there's a significant focus on funding building things that we can see physical, but there's not enough, let's say, focus on how to create the ecosystem that will actually feed the economy. Because if you create an ecosystem where you may find certain parts, and often I think the best funding is for the demand, not the supply, right? So if you look at China, for example, I was just looking at an example in insurance companies, the level of AI utilization in insurance companies, something that should be very pragmatic, and in case of a reconciliation of claims and a lot of things. And just with a colleague that is a CIO of an European insurance company, was saying that he went over there to visit one of the leading Chinese companies, and about 60 or 70% of their claims are fully automated through AI, right? So you see on one side the government funding or facilitating the building of the models, but also, again, and we're talking about China, we'll then go to the US where the model is even further that way, but they are also creating an economic ecosystem where companies can monetize it, right? And one of the things I see a lot in Europe is, okay, we're funding GPUs, but okay, how are you using those GPUs? Where is the economic angle of that? How that goes through the economy to companies that will build models, that will commercialize those models, that will then demand for the skills, right? You talk about the OpenAI deal with NVIDIA. My company is actually the one building that infrastructure, as you know, right? So we're talking about, what, 5 gigawatts to get launched in the coming days. But I had a conversation with the Commission. They asked, okay, why don't we do something like that in Europe? And my comment to them is, where is the demand? You're buying a bunch of GPUs, but then you talk about things like, oh, we want all software for free, or we are going on open source, but we have no software developers. We are breaking down if you want, the ecosystem of patents. That is what makes a lot of these companies actually monetize their research. So I think the emphasis is not on the right angles. We need to see how we can put it a seed, but then the ecosystem needs to fly by itself, right? So for me, that's the key missing aspect here in our global thinking as Europeans. Again, we're talking about foundation model, but how will those be commercialized? How will they be integrated in day-to-day operations of companies? Talk about small and medium businesses. It just needs to be part of what they do every day in very simple terms.
Yes. Constantine, how do we implant the seed towards a solid European infrastructure?
That's a good question. Good morning, everybody. Let me just say very briefly that I came to Europe recently, about 3 years ago from the US, and of course I constantly compare what I used to do in the US at some of the best research universities there and what's happening here. And talking about infrastructure, I think sometimes we just try to copy what the Americans or the Chinese are doing. And of course, there is a long tradition in the States of focusing on scale, very big scale, right? And so sometimes we see in Europe the same trend. Let's go to gigafactories or this or that. But the thing that I'm trying to say here is that Europe has the potential to succeed, not by copying what's happening at the West or at the East, but by following a different model, a model that is much more about, the so-called less is more, where maybe you have less in terms of infrastructure and scale, but more in terms of the underlying technology, the underlying know-how. I remind you that, if we look at previous industries like the airplanes, the best airplanes are built in Europe, Airbus. Some of the best cars are built in Europe. Those industries didn't compete with the West by building bigger. They were building smarter. And so I strongly believe that if Europe focuses on research, on science and development, we can create AI technologies that require less compute, less data, but better data, that will be more efficient in terms of energy consumption.
Okay, I will follow my question back to you, because I really like this concept of less is more. So we have two basic trends regarding the development of foundation models. The one requires a lot of data, many examples in order to generate more powerful models. On the other hand, we do have research that states and claims that it's more preferable to have very minimum, carefully selected examples to train the models with. What's your take on that?
Right, I see that you're following the literature very well. So there is indeed very recent work that shows that you can do equally good AI, both with less compute, and of course, DeepSeek followed that trend, and with less data, if you do very careful data filtering. And so the research that is going on can produce this kind of ideas. And I really believe that Europe has the potential there by, again, focusing on its best qualities, right? Which is focusing on building something smarter, something with higher quality, with attention to detail, not just, rushing to build the bigger possible, thing.
Again, I'll go back to Professor Draghi's report. Professor Draghi talked about the need for intensity, for scale, for high-risk, high-reward projects. What's your take on that?
I fully agree with what was said. As I was taking the Chinese example, and again, for clarity, one of the things my company has chosen not to do is to develop foundational models. Okay. So instead, what we do is to provide, if you want, the operational technology that enable you to use AI at scale. So we can get the meta models, we can get the Grok models, we can get whatever models. And one of the things we're doing alongside that is actually working with European companies and help them scale. A good example, and I'll get to your question, is AlmaWave in Italy. They developed the foundational model in the Italian supercomputer, but they need to scale and monetize it. One of the things we've observed as we work with all these models, and we as a company also develop software, is that the small language models are way more effective with less parameters to solve specific problems, with less hallucinations and problems. So one of the works we do in our company, and if I may give it as an example to what Europeans could do, and I fully agree with you, is look at specific problems to solve. If I want to solve the problem of, again, for example, we're doing a project in Spain to optimize doctor utilization and medical appointments, because you have a problem of delay in the health service, but you have a lot of no-shows. So how do you do that? Small language models have proven to be highly efficient. They consume, as you very well said, less resources. They need as I hear all the companies doing these models, the key challenge is high-quality data very well prepared, but then you don't need all that massive scale. If I go back to the Chinese example of insurance, actually that 60%, most of it is built on small language models, not large language models. So I think if we talk about the scaling of all of this, it's really about that, focusing on solving specific problems, and I agree with you. There are so many problems on which Europe has massive amounts of very good quality data. We can get that quality data, train specific models, and honestly, that's where the profitability is. If you think, always on my mind is, how do you then scale this to make sure that adoption is there? So if the economy sees the benefit, it will just keep growing. So small language models solve specific problems. And honestly, I hear all these investments of the billions of GPUs. It makes me, as a European, because it's our taxes, makes me shake a little bit.
This is a very interesting point that you're making, and actually it's a little bit contradictory to the trend today, because as you may know, don't have a legal background, but you may know that at the moment we're discussing in the EU the Cloud and Development Act. So again, I understand this is another act, however, this is, I think, a very practical one, so we need to put this in place. So the main question here is, to what kind of technologies should the Cloud and Development Act actually aim? In your opinion, what are the decisive technologies that Europe should invest on?
I'll tell you exactly what I said to the Commission. They kindly invited me to participate in the working group.
Okay,
so
great.
I'll repeat to you what I told them over and over and over again. They really should focus on funding for me research projects to solve concrete projects. I think the whole mindset of we need to create more data centers. I can tell you in the working group for the Cloud and AI Development Act, we all met together in Brussels, and it was unanimous in the room that there's not a lack of capital to create data centers and to build infrastructure. Again, my company is doing it in many places of the world. We just signed a deal to build, call it a Stargate for UAE. Exactly. So why don't we build one in Europe? Because there's no demand. There aren't many ALMA waves building models for specific use cases. There aren't enough funding for those companies because all the cost of developing those models, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of man hours, a lot of research, foundational research, and they don't have the capital, neither the European market has the appetite to put venture capital into it. So I think that's where space where actually the public funding should play into, to reduce, if you want, the research costs of those companies so that they can get to market at more affordable prices, monetize those models. And then another thing, if I may, that as I work across the various markets, that I think Europeans fundamentally lack, and as a European Portuguese that I am, we all think on our little bubble. Oh, I want to create, again, Portugal is building Amalia right now, and we want to conquer Portugal, and then we give it for free for Portuguese-speaking countries. We completely miss the mindset of scale. So when you build that in any other part of the world that I've been working with, they immediately think, okay, I'll use my market to test my model, but how do I scale it globally? And we miss that angle, right? Why do Europeans just compete with each other? We have the Italians, we want to be bigger than the Germans, and the Germans want to be bigger than the French, and so on and so forth. Guys, get your act together. Let's first take care of Europe and start actually working as Europeans. We are, again, on the democracy for, I think we as Europeans are stronger together, but then first take Europe, then take the world. And have that in your mindset as you make your investments and develop these models.
I really like this point because you are raising another major inhibitor towards European AI progress, and this is the fragmentation among the member states. So, Constantine, Dr. Karkaletsis talked about the development of Greece as a regional hub regarding AI infrastructure. How do you see this potential, and how do you see regional, at first instance, regional cooperation and connectivity, and then at a more European scale?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me first say that we talked about AI factories earlier. There is another initiative called AI Factory Antennas. So different countries in Europe that may not have an AI factory can collaborate with countries that have an AI factory. For example, in Cyprus, in Serbia, North Macedonia, and so on, there are proposals at this point to create AI factory antennas to connect with the AI factory in Greece. And so that will create some regional collaborations throughout Europe, not only here. And of course, the next step will be to create this federation of AI factories across Europe. And this is the only way. I mean, the only way is if Europe basically works together. If every country tries to win the AI race on its own, it's a complete disaster. It will not work. I hope everybody understands that.
Mr. Freitas, you come from the hardcore private sector. Okay, we talk about these developments regarding the European infrastructure. We know that Europe, at least in theory, opts a lot for open source infrastructure. How do you see, how do you understand the concept of the so-called FAIR principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable?
In the end, as you said, right, so I think open source plays a significant source, but the one thing I struggle, absolutely interoperability. I think that needs to be there by design. So I think, you know, the silos, that proprietary technology that don't talk with others, I think that creates more problems than benefits. So, but it needs to be balanced as I go back to the concept of economic development. We want to pay better salaries. I want my kid to be able to work for a European company and have a nice salary. So that European company needs to make money somehow, right? So we go back to that. We forget that economic development goes related with how actually the economy can function, right? So I think open source can play a role, but for Europe, again, my criticism, as I said this to the Commission, is that we want to use open source as a lazy way to just use someone else's code. Because if you look at a lot of the open source contributions, Europe is not at the top in many of the global open source projects. That's an embarrassment. So we have a huge open source push, but we are not the biggest contributors. That, again, I think that's a good way to spend public money. Get more lines of code into key open source projects. Right? Don't just try to use someone else's. But then on the same side, create conditions for the companies that make those investments to monetize it. I go back, open source, we talk Red Hat. Well, Red Hat is open source, but it's not a European company. Why don't you have a European Red Hat providing support? Because discussing with a lot of European telcos, oh, we want it all to be open source, so we are safe. Okay, but who are you paying support to? Red Hat. Okay, if tomorrow you are isolated from the world, who will provide the patches? Do you have the know-how on the millions of lines of open source code you use to actually maintain it? No, we don't. So are you less dependent? So I think there's a lot of philosophical discussions around open source without fully understanding the full supply chain and how to make it work on the long term in a more independent model. So I think there are aspects. One of it is open source, but there's another aspect as well, as we talk about collaboration across borders, supply chains, and things like that, that is really defining clarity on rules on how foreign entities can participate. Right? So we talk about how to build, to operate infrastructure. So as we talk, and we are in the Athens Democracy Forum, I think one of the key things is ensuring autonomy of control of the critical digital technologies that's supporting the society and the economy. Controlling the critical digital technology doesn't mean we need to own it all or build it all ourselves, right? I think one of the things that made Europe great is really trading across the world, providing value, not only its values, but also the products that it produces, right? So I think protectionism has never been good for the global economy over history, and I don't think that's the model. So I think there's a balance somewhere around, okay, global collaboration, open standards and interoperability, because as we build this, if you want more small language models, getting model orchestrators, get them to speak with each other, having agents conversing in a standard way, demands that there are standard protocols. We talk about data models to train these things, so getting standard data models across the EU where data is exchanged in certain forms. All of these will benefit, but they need to be balanced with the conscious that in the end it's not just about spending public money, is how do we then, with seed money, make the economy have interest in fund the rest. We keep talking about we need private funding. Okay, so far we mostly see the public funding. Why isn't the private funding coming? I think that should really deserve a proper reflection in the EU. To Mr. Draghi's report, right, I think, and again I read the biggest part, at least the digital part of it, and I think it's one of the best pieces of work that was done in the EU, because he basically said what we all say in these rooms when we are advising the Commission in Brussels. So he's absolutely spot on, but we need to think broadly on how does this scale and actually bring benefits to all of us as Europeans.
We need to think broadly. To be honest, I had prepared a set of questions, but I'm moving towards a totally different direction because of the very interesting discussion. We need to think broadly. Constantine, you talked about the need for not copying, rather being original and genuine. Europe usually claims as the global regulator, right? On the other hand, we say, Professor Draghi explicitly said that AI Act, for example, could be a source of uncertainty for European businesses. So how can we as Europeans actually maintain our regulatory tradition, being original, but at the same time competitive?
That's an interesting question, and I hope I will not make anybody upset with my answer. I don't believe in regulation. Maybe it's my US background. Europe will not win this war, the AI race and trying to be ahead of other countries. This will not be done with regulation. Regulation will inhibit innovation. SMEs in Europe will not succeed because of the AI Act. There has to be a better way to do this. And there is a better way to do this. We can have better technology that will create safer AI. Let me explain how. So, these models, the foundation models, are not used by themselves. You take the foundation model and then you fine-tune it to create, for example, the various chatbots. And when you do the fine-tuning, essentially you try to align the model with the values, the goals that you have. So some states, I will not name any, may prioritize fine-tuning towards what the government, what the state wants, right? Never give the answer about, XYZ political event because it doesn't agree with the state. Other states may fine-tune the models to maximize user engagement, to make us as addicted as possible to using, ChatGPT. Europe has the potential to create models and chatbots and all of that prioritize for truth, for independence, for critical thinking, for human values that we have very high in our priorities in Europe. So we can be ahead of this in this race, not by regulation. Regulation, first of all, is not making us safer. The only thing that it will do is that it will prohibit, essentially, it will give the motivation to most of these companies to not do business in Europe. And I know that I'm extreme about this, but
I really like this kind of provocative comments. Even me as a lawyer, I sometimes have this debate, these dilemmas myself. However, I see a contradicting statement here in the sense that if we want to create a trusted European ecosystem which promotes this values-driven, let's say, approach, we need some kind of, if not call it regulation, specifications. How do we create, what are the core specs for a trusted European ecosystem?
Let me pick on what you just said, because I'm absolutely with that, right? So I think one of the big challenges, and for those of us that have done business in the US, and always look at we look at that market, one of the things that it does allow is to experiment and fail fast and innovate, because the market by itself is very prone to risk. Europe's market is very adverse to risk. And so we put all the barriers at the beginning. I always give this example that when you start a business in Europe, you have a very long period and a very long pain and expense before you can launch a product, because the hurdles and the barriers are so much that you need to bake it, test it, and all of that. So your startup cost is humongous. And you go to the US and you say, okay, let me start with something half-baked, test the idea, see if it flies. And if it flies, the initial revenues generated by that idea will already fund the continued development. So my startup cost, my startup period is much smaller. So I'm with you, I'm all for standards. I think standards is a way better approach than regulation up front, because standards establish the foundational rules, and once you start to adopt, then you can check, okay, have you complied with the standards and all of that. So the adoption of standards, and there's a lot of experience in many areas. I think it's a much more robust approach, because to your point, it's just creating barriers. And one of the things that we forget is that, and I'll tell you, I've seen this in Brussels, there's a lot of legislative initiatives that are so focused on, hammering or beating the foreign suppliers that they forget that these same rules will also cause immense amount of pain to the European innovators that are less scale, have less scale, have less funding to get started. So aren't we actually feeding the same demon that we are trying to beat with all this burden of regulation, right? And then I had my own companies, I love and hate lawyers, right? In the sense that...
Me too.
In the sense that, as a company in Europe, man, the regulation moves so fast. And if you don't do it, you get beaten with millions of fines that any business, as small as you are, the legal burden of being compliant is just outrageous and creates uncertainty, because will there be another rule tomorrow that I need to keep up with? And I'm not a lawyer.
Okay. On that note, loving to hate lawyers, I think we can conclude. Thank you very much for the discussion. Thank you, the audience. Yes.
Thank you.